The threshold between the exterior and the interior disrupts the continuity of space. Architecture constantly works to mediate this perpetual dichotomy. The surface of the threshold offers ways of mediating this dissonance. Paul Virilio notes that every surface is an interface between two milieus in which a constant activity prevails, taking the form of an exchange between two substances placed in contact with one another. This new definition illustrates how contamination is at work in the concept of surface. The surface boundary becomes an osmotic membrane, a blotter. Pipilotti-Rees' video installation exploits the contamination of the surface boundary condition within Times Square's double facades. The intense interaction against the glass with her body imprints a radically different view about the physical and digital envelope spilling onto the canvas of a continuous human surface. Places like Times Square and Disney World exhibit entire interior conditions within an unbroken surface. The interiorized surface molds unique and occupiable volumes, which create new subject-to-threshold relationships of radical embodiment. In Leo Carax's highly acclaimed 2012 film, Holy Motors, he takes us on a kaleidoscopic journey, an odyssey of an actor who via method acting enters into the world, first as a beggar, then a sci-fi actor, a dying man, and a starter, to name a few. The beauty of the film is in the actor's ability to embody multiple and ambiguous roles. One wonders, does the actor possess a true identity? The beauty of our contemporary condition, as posited by the film, is in the interface of the internet age. We drift between different lives and identities such that a surface condition arises of internal complexity. In one of the film's great aphorisms, the actor asks, "What if there is no more beholder?" suggesting that we no longer frame conditions foreign to our own. We have the capacity to embody foreign interiorities and move fluidly through each as a new environment. I believe that this is a revolutionary way of thinking. We will inhabit multiple interiorities throughout our lifetime, both physically and perceptually. As part of the exit review process, we were asked to think of our presentations as the beginning of our own personal architectural project, and I mean project with a capital P. My exit review is a reaction against the project. It is an atmospheric argument that takes hold of the pleasures and delectations within our field. Or to put it in architectural terms, I am a fox, not a hedgehog. While my talk may wander like a Borgesian story, a James Joyce epic, or the great infinite jest of David Foster Wallace, my argument fits the structure of interiority based on its own raison d'etre. These diagrams illustrate the complex structural manifolds of the author's interiorized worlds. Each argument compounds in a nonlinear fashion, weaving together anecdotal knots of apperceptive experience. Touching on atmosphere, surface, and geometry, it becomes a prismatic argument with moments of clarity. In a larger sense, like Wallace, I'm interested in recovering the beauty in everyday life in an over-the-top, indulgent way. As Foster said, I want to author things that both restructure worlds and make living people feel stuff. This making living people feel stuff is an important part of being a creator, and by extension, of being an architect. First, I would like to consider the psychology which underpins the inability of built environments to make living people feel. Both Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault suggest that, although unaware, we exist indefinitely in interiors. All interiors are in crisis, including housing, schools, prisons, and government buildings. For Deleuze, these institutions are subject to perpetual reform, ultimately creating societies of control. One is never really finished with anything inside these perpetual interiors where school, work, and family space all begin to mirror vast spaces of enclosure. Deleuze offers consolation. No need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons of resistance. If we are drifting between these interiors of perpetual banality that we inhabit without critical or bodily awareness, then the weapons of resistance must include ways to reanimate metaphysical responsiveness. Bless you. Sociologist Bruno Latour offers a similar reading of the current condition, where the natural world has become an internalized political realm. The once absolute difference between inside and outside has been drained of significance. The surface of the envelope negotiates the relationship between the inside and the outside, and as such is the key to reactivating architecture as a subtle form of resistance. Architecture constantly oscillates between periods of working with or against the envelope, the most recent iteration occurring as the modernist explosion of the envelope and the deconstructivist rupturing of it. I want to explore a resistance that is not in confrontation with, but in negotiation with the surface of the envelope. Interiors do not have to be banal or subsidiary to the exterior, but can be very powerful. Interiors are strangely beautiful, or as poet Charles Baudelaire wrote, the beautiful is always strange. There is something familiar and yet surprising in the interior. From the interior of architecture, we realize our own internal manifold body. Here we have the urban center which one floats within, the never-ending pleasures of the Baths of Caracalla, the spirituality and domesticity of a mosque, the infinite mirrored world where one loses oneself, or the interior pavilion that engulfs visitors and spits them out like a giant beast. These are all examples and representations of the fantasy of the interior realm, taken to the extreme limits of the threshold. When the envelope is re-engaged, fantastical experiences take place. In architecture, there is a long history of animated interior envelopes. One kind, Phantasmagoria, a form of theater created in the late 17th century, used a magic lantern to project frightening images. The purpose was to scare the audience to death. Occasionally, that goal was accomplished. However, once the audience realized that each image was a projection, trepidation gave rise to excitement and performance in the form of spectacle. The distorted imagery was a type of projective anamorphosis, where the images appeared skewed until viewed from a special angle. The effects were augmented with smoke, shadow, overlay of images, exaggerated scale, and other techniques to further distort the atmosphere. In the projective cast, Robin Evans describes the nature of the image and finds that the normal expression of perspective is an experience of distorted imagery. Unless the viewer is fixed to one point, or one eye in this case, the picture will appear anamorphic. Albrecht Dürer's perspective machines, although similar to vision, cannot produce the exact contours of what they represent. Accepting the natural anamorphic qualities of vision, Phantasmagoria exaggerated the distorted and peripheral qualities of human vision through illusion. Like the Sacrobosco Bomarzo, anamorphic projection walks along the dark side, where figuration triggers dramatic emotion. The atmosphere is thickened by projection, and as such is ornamentation against the architectural surface. In the work of Pipilotti Rist, the atmosphere as Phantasmagoria is thickened by projective ornament. The effect of Rist's artwork comes by projecting bodily imagery of an overwhelming scale onto interior surfaces. The imagery is too close for the rational distancing needed to sensibly judge the art. The work invites us in to relax in a public communal setting and feel the pleasure of private sensation. It is similar to Baroque frescoes, where the painting, sculpture, and architecture emerge from the surface of the wall or ceiling, enveloping one in an all-encompassing interior. Rist's Gravity Be My Friend installation proves that video art can supplant painting's traditional role as medium applied to architectural surface, albeit temporarily and on a more intimate scale. Despite the success of Rist's work, the projections are only a thick ornamentation that do not change the architecture, but are a veil of screens, temporary furniture, and wall arrangements. James Turrell's projections interact with the architecture more, as in the work The Light Inside, distorting our perception of walls with the use of light. The projections also form the surface of the envelope in his architectural follies that show his rear projections and skywalls. At first glance, his openings seem to be frame views. Rather, his rear projections and skywalls work together to become a surface condition. The subject relationship that Turrell frames is one of transcendental enlightenment, whereas Rist tightens the cognitive distancing between the art and the person. The body is the surface to mold the projection. The skin of the architecture is the surface of the projection. At certain points, the images on the surface of Sand Sty blur together so much that it is nearly impossible to tell the effects of one from the other. The architectural surface in these installations is secondary. Projection that is integral to the architectural surface can be seen in the Phillips Pavilion of 1958. Using the technology and structural ingenuity of the time, Enes Tsenikis, Edgar Varese, and Le Corbusier created an immersive interior, a body that one enters into to experience film and music. Where Turrell's projects are about the individual entering the body of a pilgrimage site or becoming disoriented within a museum, the Phillips Pavilion is an architecture of communal pleasure. It is not a neutral architectural body, but a thick surface of an animate envelope. Like the other works, the Phillips Pavilion distorts perceptions with exaggerated scale, overlay of imagery, and shadow from walls. What if Rist's video art became architecturalized in the same way that Varese's music formed the Phillips Pavilion? In this way, I'm interested in interiors that animate exteriors. This is possible through the thick surface of architecture, by which I mean an envelope that is not necessarily physically thick, but is metaphorically thick in response to the energy of the interior. An early example of interiors that animate exteriors is the roofscape of Chambord that signifies its domestic interior with multiple chimneys, gables, and circular turret, all indicating the domestic pleasure within the chateau. The double helix staircase and the rooftop are additions to the original fortress-like residence, and so as additive elements, they transform not only the form but the organization of the chateau. The helix stair organizes the chateau from the center and works its way to the roofscape, animating its landscape with other architectural figures and human occupation. In this way, the singular element of the interior transforms the exterior. As Sylvia Lavin remarks in Kissing Architecture, the profound pressure between two things is redesigning the way architecture exercises power. This power comes from the way that architects negotiate surface. The Tel Aviv Museum of Preston Scott Cohen is an example of a contemporary semi-autonomous interior with its atrium lightfall. Both Tel Aviv and Chambord's centerpieces provide views across interiors and are unoccupiable at the center except at the ground level. Each singular element impacts our subjectivity. Inside the double helix of Chambord, we see other people in motion differently. Looking through Lightfall at Tel Aviv, we see the art inside the museum in a new way. There are important differences between contemporary and Renaissance thinking. The double helix is a solid ideal figure where two people poetically orbit around the center that evokes a stable cosmology. Cohen's Lightfall, although made through seemingly rational projective geometries of hyperbolic parabolas, produces irrational effects. We never perceive the rational figure. Like Chambord's staircase, Lightfall organizes the rest of the building as a centripetal force that impacts the gallery spaces. The effect of the interior singular element against the rest of the building creates tension and animates the building. I want to extract certain effects from the Baroque understanding of surface that have the possibility to evoke metaphysical responsiveness in individuals today. By the end of the 16th century, an aura of doubt went across Europe with Martin Luther and Erasmus challenging the Church, and Copernicus dislocating the Earth from the center of the universe. The dislocation of certainty transformed the era into one of pluralism, with infinite suns and planets, all in a dramatic play of forces, not dissimilar from the scientific, albeit more complex view now of infinite universes and dimensions. The powerful transformation of scientific and moral belief infused the aesthetics of the time. The 17th century effects in Francesco Borromini's San Carlo are only possible through a continuous surface of curves that makes it difficult to discern each constituent part of the envelope. Or in the Hotel de Beauvai's continuous figural surface that emerges from a compressed context that has the effect of infinite expansion and containment. The surface is pushed to the foreground, animating the envelopes to create embodied spaces that address some of the shortcomings inherent to Tel Aviv and Chambord. This intense method of pushing the surface to the foreground permeates painting as well at the time, notably in the work of the father of the Baroque school of painting, Caravaggio. Doubting Thomas, but Caravaggio is a spectacle, a Baroque foreshortening in chiaroscuro, where everything is pushed up close to the viewer in dramatic lighting. Caravaggio makes it seem as if Christ is touching the surface and not existing within a frame, giving us a reciprocal sensation where we are the ones touching the surface of Christ's wound. We trust in the situation because of the touch. We give up control to the artist himself who contracts the conditions of our own submission. It is through these situational erotics that we are cast in roles as beholders, and this effect empowers us as viewers. In The Invisible Dragon, Dave Hickey writes that the rituals of aesthetic submission are analogous to sexual and spiritual submission, a concept that resonates in the rituals of our architectural experience. These types of experiences are private, where we must give ourselves up and trust in the architectural devices. The effects become internalized. Architectural devices, like Baroque painting, collapse and conflate the hierarchies of our response. There is a fusion of pleasure and control, trust and apprehension. Essentially, Baroque art and architecture empower the viewer and ultimately become communal spaces of pleasure. The double entendre of the Baroque is its ability to represent two positions at once. Religious iconography and secular corporeality should be at odds with one another, but the strength of this conflict is largely why people then and now find these works to be so powerful. The secular corporeal matters like sexuality and cultural taboos, such as Caravaggio's use of criminals, he himself was a criminal, as models for his paintings, as well as prostitutes, show the permeation of profane expression into religious subjects. The stark realness of the imagery is lifted to the static and sacred, thus it is nearly impossible to separate out these matters when we are arrested before an image. It forces us to collapse the hierarchies of our response to art, religion, sexuality, and cultural norms, which are then conflated and pushed to the foreground as visceral material. At first, this causes anxiety for the average viewer, but it is hard not to give in to the pleasure of what seems to be too much. Hickey compares Robert Mapplethorpe's controversial work to Caravaggio's. Mapplethorpe's work celebrates marginality and lifts it to formally beautiful artwork. And someone begs the question, is art for the benefit of the institution, or is it that the hyper-institutionalization of art ignores what is intrinsic in the work to begin with? With this in mind, we must ask, what does the work propose to us? The inability to extract the parts from the whole in a work of art, or its intrinsic nature, means that beauty is the maximum arbiter of slippage between how the art looks and what it means to us as the privileged beholden. Art and architecture need the subversive pleasure of situational erotics, where the surface makes us question our perceptions of the spatiality of our held beliefs. If expression requests power, an example of the cultural implications of Caravaggio, then persuasion is the method that gains power, the formal beauty of Caravaggio's paintings. Foucault suggests that power is produced from one moment to the next, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Is there room for resistance within this ambiguous realm? Foucault adds that where there is power, there is resistance, but never on the exterior, always on the interior of power itself. So here we find ourselves using the persuasion of beauty to foster the power of resistance in momentary, internal, and plural ways. The interiority of power can be a metaphor for architecture through the literal investigation of the interior pressing against the envelope surface. The energy of the interior can produce profound pressure against the architectural envelope, thereby making the distinction between the two ambiguous. Regardless of the advancements of our age, the mode of interaction in response to the Baroque surface treatment is left unchanged. Concerning the surface, there are other approaches that negotiate the relationship between interior and exterior that provide metaphysical responsiveness for individuals. One such approach is the implied surface, where the exterior envelope denies the literal apprehension of volumes beyond, but affords a trace and allusion to what just might be inside. This uncertainty both on and behind the surface is not unlike the anticipation one feels before the curtain rising of a play. By covering the Reichstag with fabric, Christo and Jean-Claude recall the renovation the building went through after its destruction in World War II. The effect is utterly gripping, leaving one to question what is behind the curtain, and one is inevitably disappointed upon the reveal of the architectural object. The resistance between the exterior as a symbol of power against its temporary material calls into question its stasis as an object. The fabric turns the Reichstag into a singular object in the center of an interiorized public plaza, empowering citizens by the gesture of its subversive pleasure. In Stuttgart, this anti-monument theme is on full display at another institutional building, the new Staatsgallery of James Stirling. The monument is already a ruin, replaced by a void that is given back to the people with a pedestrian path running from the street through the void to the residential hillside above. The path is deflected again and again. Its off-center trajectory makes one feel that they are occupying a Baroque painting. Anxiety and stimulation are brought to the foreground. It is the singular element in the scheme producing unsettling pressure against the surface of the voided center, expanding to cultivate the public sphere not imposed upon it. By imagining the monumental object, the individual is empowered through bypassing, engaging with, and questioning one's relationship with the museum and architecture in general. In Chambord's roofscape, internal energy rises up and transforms the exterior into a landscape of visual and haptic pleasure. Likewise, the interior of the walled-in roof garden at the Unité de Habitation in Marseille is such a place where objects of an interiorized realm are surrounded by mountain and sky. Le Corbusier's interest in the Acropolis at Athens can help describe the Unité's roofscape. The internalized rituals of culture rise out of the architectural plinth in the Acropolis, just as the Unité's rooftop garden celebrates the poetics of daily life in the apartments below. For Le Corbusier, the massive parapet is a little less than 5.5 feet high. It protects and it also screens out the mediocre reality of the down-to-earth, limiting views towards the mountains, sea, and horizon beyond. I too dwelled in Arcadia 10 years from now. This is what the graduates of our nursery school will be saying. This intimate lyrical landscape is the static concretization of modern rituals. One can imagine children running around the track, swimming in the pool, singing in the theater, and climbing on the artificial mountains. The repetitive and monastic quality of the apartments is in stark contrast to the roof garden. Full of expression and communal joy, it is as if the internal energy that is repressed in the apartments below streams out of the expressive figures above. The pantheistic tradition is alluded to by Le Corbusier and is continued in our love of Olympic sports, where the body in motion is celebrated as an aesthetic event. Zaha Hadid states that the form of the aquatic center at the recent London Olympics expresses the movement of water, and I would add that the forms are the architectural embodiment of movement in water. The figural diving boards are concrete objects that embrace internal energy pushed through the surface. The rituals become permanently aestheticized, a person diving with his arms out wide, weightless, a butterfly swimmer flying through the water, contrasting the massive roof, itself bowing down into the water. The drama and tension are palpable, the landscape of embodied ritual made manifest in architectural form. Another approach is when internal objects press into the exterior envelope and mold the surface. Internal expression rising to the surface is apparent in the new work of Tony Craig. His sculptures are reminiscent of the Baroque objects in round, with the same degree of plasticity as at all points without losing interest in specific moments. This exploration of the relationship between the center and its projection is manifest in Frank Gehry's Vitro Museum, where the interior is thrust against the exterior membrane. One must always ask, do the objects subsume into the wall or do the objects become hollow volumes? Here it is both. The same emotive factor in objects happens in a still life by Giorgio Morandi, where discrete forms are superimposed in a subjective interpretation of volume, yet the movement between the forms is imagined. Whereas in the Craig, the internal energy is already physically manifest in the surface. Vitro has these same qualities, but unlike the additive surface mentioned earlier, the expressed interior surface is not functional, the staircase notwithstanding. In this way, it frees the interior and exterior to be expressive despite functionality. The thick surface belies the absence of the objects on the interior and makes way for the extraordinary effects of the internal volumes within one large room. Subversive pleasure is fostered by combining the sacred interior effects of a church-like volume with the profane activities of touching art in a furniture gallery setting. Projective geometry offers a rational way to grasp at the sensational effects of the interior influencing the exterior. Athanasius Kircher demystified Phantasmagoria by studying the science of projection to produce surface ornamentation. This is discussed again by Evans, who demonstrates the historical shift from the object to its image by way of projective geometry when he states that composition obtains all its value in the way it is projected, which is the result of geometry. Durr's linear perspectives arrest images and reduces the scope of human vision. It is not as precise as geometry, nor as fantastic as the illusionistic. The Phillips Pavilion is the most successful in this regard because it uses both projective ornamentation and projective geometry to create an environment that absorbs the peripheral and abstract. The architecture has video on its varying surface, which is not a one-dimensional interaction like Riest, but a polyvalent surface of video, music, sculpture, and undulating walls of an underlying geometry. The ornamental projections are time-based, constructing a microcosmology, even to the smallest detail of sculptural speakers that look like constellations. After inviting individuals to inhabit the body, the laws of the micro-universe are pushed to the maximum effect with exaggeration and distortion that completely dislocate the visitor. The geometry of the structure plays a role, namely because the ornamental projection is specifically choreographed to the surface. Even the music of Varese is parabolic. In the tradition of Antoni Gaudi, whose hung structural models used the energy of the interior to describe the form, the Phillips Pavilion also used inverted models to create hyperbolic paraboloidal surfaces. The projective geometrical devices of Kircher also transform the envelope and function of a building, his most notable being his speaking tubes. Like the Phillips Pavilion, these devices are both geometric and bodily that collapses the intellectual and emotive hierarchies of our response. Evans states that in geometry, geometrical figures are not media, but in architectural design they are, since their task is to convey shape from one state to another, meaning that geometry can affect the way we perceive movement. The movement between one state to another is prevalent in Cohen's work, Lightfall at Tel Aviv, where the porosity gives a multivalent presence to the gallery experience. There is a degree of imagination needed on the part of the visitor to see Lightfall, just as Evans suggests about imaginary space. The projection onto the molded surface of buildings involves the observer's corroboration to produce effects. Tel Aviv's Lightfall operates at a level between art and architecture, for it insists on the observer's collaborative effort to be successful. We do and do not occupy the space the same condition as a work of art. It is notable that Cohen considered removing Lightfall like a piece of art from a gallery after the surface gained the public's acclaim, overshadowing the building's design. Although inventive, Cohen's work borders on the stable, not realizing the potential of anamorphosis, and could be pushed even further to produce intrinsic effects. The mass has been lightened and is freed from any gravitational pull, but does it demonstrate gravity in the same way as a Craig sculpture? The push and pull between the stability of a counterpoint fighting gravity are taken to their limit in Craig sculptures. The properties of our perception are derived from the contemporary limits of technology. Advanced mathematics and physics describe individual interiorities of the universe's underlying structure, relativity, string theory, and M theory, that are on the verge of being universal, but are irreconcilable at this time in history because they are contingent on human perception, like the spectrum of colors that we see. Evidently, what we see and study is only a sliver of reality. The artistic expression of an individual interiority is found in Craig sculptures that portray energetic vibration and play against gravity. It is interesting that the formal representation of these advanced theories is similar to his continuous surface wrapped in on itself. The expression of the surface is the key, as Craig states that manipulation is another way of using the surface to show valency. Even if the form looks quite wild, the sculpture was molded in negative, that is to say from the inside. It's not a conflict, it's not a confrontation, it can't answer the question, why do we look like this? But it attempts to provide ways of thinking about that question. From the imaginative to the everyday, projective geometries can be poetic additions like the figures of Le Corbusier and Hadid. Evans discusses the splaying conic surface of masonry at the Chateau d'Annay by Philibert Delorme that has the effect of being suspended in the air. Projective geometries are an expression of extraneous surface, yet they are completely innovative, the result of technology and willed problems. It is a difficult thing to achieve and only possible through innovation. It suggests the anamorphous, voluptuous, and even suggestive form. Delorme used layout drawings for the projective geometry. It allowed Delorme, through 15 drawings superimposed, to describe 7 wedges of stone that had to be cut perfectly. From the rational to the fantastic, science and technology can transform architecture into the phantasmagoric. The work of projective geometry today is continued by Preston Scott Cohen. In his essay on San Carlo ai Catenari, Cohen studies the anomalies of this field. Like Delorme's trompe, the elliptical windows of the sacristy have an obvious exploration of geometry. The unknown Baroque architect invented tubes that burrow through the existing building, allowing more diffuse light in than a conventional window. The form can only be discerned by looking at the interior in relation to the exterior. The embrasure and ellipse show the metamorphic process of the intersection of cylinders and cones. As Craig states, surfaces have a value when materials interact with one another or are the function of underlying geometries. A circle can be extended into 3 dimensions, becoming a cylinder, a finger, a tree, or a membrane experiencing internal pressure, almost a universal for vital energy. The wonder of the Baroque, with its geometrical virtuosity and optical devices, is filtered through the lens of Cohen's analysis and recapitulated in his own work. Cohen takes pleasure in the fact that architectural codes of decorum forbid embrasure from intersecting, much less burrowing through a classical corner pilaster. And like the anomalous device of Kircher, the architectural taboo creates subversive pleasure and performs extraordinarily. More in line with Craig's expression of vital energy, the Phillips Pavilion is more bodily by incorporating an intimate scale. The architecture is immersive like an interactive body. The Phantasmagoria permeates this expressionist pavilion by varying surface with multifaceted walls to re-engage the modern blasé individual with ornamental projections. The surface is not flat like a TV screen, a Reese projection, or Cohen's Lightfall, where one grasps the thinness of the surface. Lightfall is much less thick, less bodily, and less affecting as a result. What if we were to explore the possibilities that the Phillips Pavilion laid out more than 50 years ago with current technology? Or to bring up a more recent technological feat of the Luftwerk lights at Cloudgate, what if we were to make an architecture that could transport inhabitants into pure synesthesia? In the precedent of the Phillips Pavilion, one's perceptions are not framed, but are consumed by the architecture. A film that consumes one's perceptions is Lars von Trier's Melancholia. The opening scene shows the gravity of another planet collapsing our rational understanding of physical certainty. A horse deflates into flatness, a mother sinks into a non-existent ground, and a bride is dragged into the web of gravity's magnitude. Like a Craig sculpture defying the counterpoint of gravity, it is a representation of the total obliteration of physical certitude on an intimate scale. As I have revealed, the surface can produce a number of important effects for architecture. The surface encompasses the individual and affective potentialities. The surface draws us into the situational erotics of trusting the medium or form. And finally, the surface reestablishes the significance and power of the interior forming the exterior. Going forward, I too want to totally obliterate physical certitudes on an intimate and bodily scale. By extracting the sublime effects of the phantasmagoric and anamorphic, I hope to explore the projective multivalent states of embodied intimacy. In the past, as an artist, I worked on imagery that combined the bodily and sublime. Now, as an architect, I am working on creating fantastical and bodily realities within surface and volume. Zemeckis, Cohen, and Craig's underlying mathematical principles produce the incredible anomalies and unique effects of their internal and external forms. I wish to push the limits of effect by superimposing the sublime and intimate to create an atmosphere of communal subversive pleasure. Thus, resistance re-engages the responsive surface, metaphysically empowering not only the inhabitants, but the expressive, influential possibilities of the architect. Thank you.
I now realize I should save my appreciations for the final comments, so I'm just going to ask a question. In relationship to the talk, and especially in this last moment where you talk about your aspirations to make these phantasmagorical yet communal experiences, not to hold you to your initial trope, but the holy motors, which I'd never heard of before, but you took the effort to pull out this quote about, what happens if there's no more beholder? And I'm just wondering if you could help me make sense of that quote in relationship to your talk. Because when you first started it, it seemed like a way of talking about the beholder in terms of the architectural object, in terms of its exteriority, and then thinking about its interior. But as you've gone on, I think you've actually used that quote or drawn from it in a couple of different ways. And I'm just curious if you could speak to that for me.
Yes, I'm very interested in the beholden in art history and in architectural history. So I talked about Caravaggio and how when you're viewing his paintings, the surface is pushed to the foreground, and so you feel like you're a part of the situation, or you're forced to become a part of the situation. And I think that translates into a lot of the architectural examples that I showed, like the Vitra Museum as well, where it's a furniture gallery setting, and you're expected to touch the work, and but it's in this volume that's church-like, and so it's like the collapsing of profane and sacred things. And I think the idea of the beholden for holy motors has to do with that as well. It's the idea of not looking at something voyeuristically, but becoming a part of the situation.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.